The signal buoy at the edge of the Threnody Reaches had been silent for 187
but
years,
answered.
and every civilization that mattered had stopped listening to it decades ago. So when the ancient relay crackled awake in the middle of the Covenant's sundering ceremony, 300 delegates froze in their seats, and the presiding magistrate's voice caught on a word she had spoken 10,000 times before without ever expecting an answer. Sol, she had said, the way she said every name on the long list of the dead. Sol system, third planet, designation, Earth, species, human, status, presumed extinct following the long silence, struck from the Covenant registry this cycle by unanimous consent. It was a formality. It was supposed to be a formality. The sundering ceremony existed to release the galaxy's grief, not to summon anything back from it. Once every 50 years, the Covenant of Bound Stars gathered in the Threnody Spire to read the names of every member world that had gone dark and never answered again, and to formally release their seats, their treaties, their unclaimed obligations, so that the living could move forward without the weight of the vanished pulling at their sleeves. Nobody expected an answer. Nobody had received one in 4 centuries. Then the old relay screamed a challenge frequency that had not been used since Earth's induction into the Covenant, and a voice, small, distant, traveling across dead space on power that should not have been enough to reach anyone, spoke into the silence of the Spire's grand chamber. This is Ambassador Naomi Reyes, representing the Sol Compact and the peoples of Earth, answering the roll call of the Covenant of Bound Stars. We heard you say our name. We are still here. For 11 full seconds, no one in that chamber breathed. Magistrate Ael Thessarine of the Vastar Concordance, presiding officer of the sundering ceremony, stood with one clawed hand still raised in the gesture that closed a name from the registry forever, and found that her voice would not work. Behind her, in the vast concentric rings of the amphitheater, delegates from 41 species leaned forward as one organism, antennae twitching, crystalline skin flushing with light, breathing apparatus hissing in confusion, because the last thing any of them had prepared for today was a ghost that talked back. And in the farthest, coldest reaches of what the Covenant star charts still labeled the dead zone, a battered survey vessel with human hands on its controls held its position at the edge of an ancient relay station, having just gambled the entire future of its species on 11 seconds of silence turning into something else. Naomi Reyes did not know, in that moment, whether she had just saved her civilization or ended it. To understand why a message 4 minutes long could matter so much, you had to understand what humanity had lost, and what it had spent nearly 2 centuries clawing back in the dark. 230 years earlier, Earth had been young in the eyes of the galaxy, but not unwelcome. First contact had come not as an invasion or a rescue, but as an invitation, a slow, careful courtship conducted over 11 years by an alien envoy from a species called the Ilun, patient silicon-based beings who lived for millennia and measured trust in generations rather than handshakes. The Ilun had watched humanity's radio signals leak into the dark for over a century before making themselves known, and when they finally did, they did not offer humanity technology or salvation. They offered membership, a seat, a voice among the stars, provisional and unproven, but real. Earth had accepted. The Sol Compact was born, a fragile, quarrelsome, astonishingly hopeful confederation of nations that had, for the first time in human history, found something bigger than their old borders to build together. They joined the Covenant of Bound Stars as its newest and smallest member, a civilization that had barely finished fighting itself long enough to look up, now sitting at a table with the Vastar Concordance, whose war fleets had once humbled empires spanning 100 systems, and the Korathi Assembly, whose hive-minded architects had raised structures that made planets orbit them instead of stars, and the Ilun themselves, whose libraries held records older than Earth's oceans. For 31 years, humanity learned. It sent scholars to Vastar academies and came home with theories of subspace propulsion. It sent farmers to Korathi agricultural collectives and came home with crops that could grow in soil no one on Earth had believed arable. It sent diplomats to 100 worlds and came home, again and again, with the same quiet realization that humanity was not special, not chosen, not destined, but that it was wanted, and for a species that had spent its whole history wondering if it was alone, being wanted was its own kind of miracle. Then, in the 32nd Yi, R of the Sol Compact's membership, the sky above Earth went wrong. No one, not even now, fully understood what happened at what came to be called the Long Silence, the subspace corridor that connected Sol to the rest of Covenant space, a stable, centuries-old transit lane maintained by relay buoys along its entire length, collapsed without warning, in a cascading failure that swallowed every signal, every ship, every scrap of data trying to pass through it. The last confirmed transmission from Earth described a tremor in the corridor itself, a sensation the outgoing Covenant liaison vessel's captain compared, in her final garbled words, to the space folding the wrong way, like something reached in and pulled. And then nothing. For 6 years, the Covenant sent rescue and survey missions to the edge of the collapsed corridor, and every one of them turned back, unable to punch through, unable to raise so much as a whisper from the other side. Theories multiplied: a natural subspace fracture, a Covenant enemy sabotage, an internal Sol compact catastrophe, a resource the humans had unknowingly disturbed. None could be proven. The corridor simply would not reopen, and Earth, 300 light-years down a road that no longer existed, fell silent. The galaxy, as galaxies do, grieved for a while, argued about whose fault it was for a while longer, and then, because civilizations that measure their histories in millennia cannot afford to hold their breath for one small species forever, moved on. Sol's seat in the Covenant chamber remained empty but reserved for the first 50 years, a courtesy extended to every lost member in case of return. When that half-century passed with no contact, Sol's seat became presumed lost. And now, 187 years after the long silence began, the sundering ceremony had finally come to read Earth's name off the list of the grieved and let it go. What the Covenant did not know, what almost no one beyond a handful of Ilan archivists still remembered to wonder about, was that on the other side of that collapsed corridor, humanity had not died. It had simply been left alone with the pieces of everything it had learned in 31 years of contact, and 2 centuries to figure out how to get back. The corridor's collapse had not been a clean severing. It had thrown transit lanes into chaos for nearly a decade, isolating dozens of systems along its length, not just Sol. Earth, cut off from resupply, technology updates, and diplomatic support, had faced a choice that other stranded worlds along the corridor had not survived: rebuild alone or die slow. Humanity chose to rebuild. It had not been graceful. The first 30 years after the silence had been the hardest in the Compact's short history. Economies built on Covenant trade collapsed, colonies on Mars, and in the asteroid belt that had depended on alien technology for life support, endured brutal, deadly transitions to self-sufficiency. And more than one government on Earth itself nearly fractured under the strain of a species suddenly, terrifyingly alone again. But something the Ilan had once told a young human diplomat in the earliest days of contact turned out to be true in a way no one had expected. Humans did not do well with abundance, but they were extraordinary in scarcity. Cut off, frightened and furious at a universe that had shown them a door, and then slammed it shut, humanity spent a century and a half rebuilding everything it had lost and inventing things it never would have needed to invent had the corridor stayed open. They rebuilt subspace theory from salvaged fragments of Ilan and Vashtar technical manuals, filling in the gaps with a century of their own mathematics. They built ships that were uglier and less elegant than anything the Covenant produced, but that worked, and that kept working when things went wrong, because humans had learned to build for failure in a way species with older, more stable technology sometimes forgot how to do. They sent probes and then crewed vessels searching for any way around the dead corridor, for 2 full generations, before the third generation finally found one, not a repair of the old road, but an entirely new one, a slower, more dangerous route through unstable subspace pockets that no Covenant navigator would have dared attempt, because no Covenant navigator had spent 150 years learning to survive on the ragged edge of what their instruments could reliably predict. Ambassador Naomi Reyes had not been alive for any of that. She had been born 40 years after the corridor's collapse, into a Sol compact that had already stopped waiting to be rescued and started building itself into something new. She had grown up on stories of the Covenant the way earlier generations of humans had grown up on stories of ancient empires, half history, half myth, filtered through the memories of people who had actually walked among the stars and the anxious hope of people who had only heard about it. She had studied every scrap of Covenant law, culture, and language that Earth's archives still held, not because anyone believed they would ever need it again, but because the small, stubborn part of humanity that refused to accept the long silence as permanent needed someone ready, in case the day ever came. When the survey ship Wanderlight finally broke through into open, mapped subspace 3 months ago, and picked up its first Covenant Standard navigation beacon in 187 years, Naomi Reyes had been the Compact's ranking diplomatic officer aboard, and the decision about what humanity did next had fallen, with terrifying suddenness, onto her. She had wanted more time. She had wanted to send word home, to convene the full Sol Compact assembly, to plan an approach with the caution the moment deserved. But the beacon they'd found had carried an automated broadcast, still repeating after nearly 2 centuries, announcing the schedule of the Covenant's next great ceremonial gathering, the 50-year sundering at the Threnody Spire, where the names of the presumed dead would be formally released. And buried in the broadcast's metadata, updated more recently than the rest, was a preliminary agenda listing the systems scheduled to be struck from the registry this cycle. Sol was on it. There had been no time to go home and ask permission. There had been barely enough time to reach the edge of Covenant space, find an old relay strong enough to punch a signal into the heart of the spire itself, and speak before the gavel fell and Earth's name was closed forever, because Naomi Reyes did not know, and no one in the Sol Compact could tell her, what happened to a species that let its own funeral finish, whether the door would still be open after, whether it even mattered whether it was. So she had gambled everything on 11 seconds of silence. And now, in the Threnody Spire's grand chamber, 300 delegates from 41 species stared at the ancient relay hub through which a dead world had just spoken, and the presiding magistrate of the Vastar Concordance found her voice at last. "Identify yourself again," Aelthesarine said, her translator crackling with something between disbelief and dread. "State your designation. State your authority to speak for the Sol system." Ambassador Naomi Reyes, Sol Compact Diplomatic Corps, speaking under the authority granted by the Compact's Joint Assembly, Naomi said, and was grateful not for the first time that decades of training had taught her to keep her voice level even when her hands, out of sight of any camera, were shaking against the edge of the console. "I apologize for the manner of this contact. We only learned of today's proceedings 3 hours ago by your reckoning. We came as fast as we could." "You came," repeated a new voice, cooler and sharper, cutting in from somewhere else in the chamber. "From where, Ambassador? The Sol corridor has been impassable for nearly 2 centuries. Every survey mission the Covenant sent confirmed it. What vessel of yours claims to have crossed it?" Naomi recognized the voice's cadence even before the translator finished rendering it. Clipped, precise, faintly contemptuous. The accent pattern the Covenant's translation algorithms assigned to speakers of the Ashen Directorate, a coalition of trade and security worlds that had, Naomi's briefing files told her, grown considerably more powerful during humanity's long absence. She filed the hostility away without letting it show in her reply. "We didn't cross the old corridor," she said. "It's still collapsed as far as we can tell. We've never been able to reopen it. We found a new route, A longer one, through unstable subspace regions your navigational charts mark as impassable. It took us 3 years of real-time travel to reach the edge of mapped Covenant space. I'd be glad to share our navigational data with any delegation the Covenant designates, once trust has been established. A murmur went through the chamber, alien in a dozen different registers, the dry rustle of Korathi mandibles, the low resonant hum of something Naomi's translator simply labeled Githrani, a species she didn't recognize, born or risen to prominence sometime in the 2 centuries humanity had missed. She felt more than saw the scale of how much had changed while Earth was gone, and understood for the first time just how small and fragile her 4-minute transmission truly was against it. This is either the most remarkable act of survival I have witnessed in 4 centuries of service, said a third voice, older, unhurried, threaded through with something that might have been genuine wonder, or the most elaborate deception. I would like, before anything else is decided in this chamber, to know which. Naomi's briefing files placed this voice with near certainty. Ilun. Elder caste, judging by the layered harmonics B. Neath the translated words, which the Ilun used to signal age and standing among themselves the way humans might once have used gray hair and titles. It was, she realized with a small, unexpected ache, the closest thing to a familiar voice in that entire chamber. The Ilun had been Earth's first friends among the stars, and some ancient, aching part of her had hoped, foolishly, that 187 years would not have erased all trace of that friendship. I welcome any verification the Covenant requires, Naomi said. We have not come to demand anything. We came because you were about to speak our name for the last time, and we did not want you to speak it into an empty room. The chamber went quiet again, differently this time. Not the frozen shock of the first 11 seconds, but something more complicated, tangled with the low currents of political calculation Naomi could feel moving beneath the silence even across the vast distance of the transmission. She had spent her whole career reading rooms full of humans who didn't want to show their hands. She understood, distantly and without much comfort, that whatever this room was doing now, it was doing the same thing on a scale she barely had the tools to measure. Magistrate Aelthesarine broke the silence first, and when she spoke again, her voice had steadied into something formal and careful, the voice of someone choosing every word for the historical record. The sundering ceremony is suspended, she said, pending verification of this contact and formal review by the Covenant's Standing Committee on Membership and Return. Ambassador Reyes, your transmission originates from a relay station at the edge of the dead zone. Do you have the capacity to bring your vessel to the Threnody Spire directly, under escort, for formal proceedings? Naomi glanced, off transmission, at her small crew, 3 exhausted, hopeful faces that had spent 3 years of their lives crossing dead space on a gamble even less certain than this one. Captain Idris Akafer, at the Wanderlight's helm, gave her a single, small nod. We can be there within the week, under whatever escort and conditions the Covenant requires, Naomi said. We ask only that Earth's name remain on the registry, unstruck, until that review is complete. There was a pause, not hesitation exactly, but the weight of 41 species doing 41 different kinds of math in their heads at once. Granted, Aelthesarine said at last. The name remains. The roll call will resume when you arrive, Ambassador, and it will resume with your answer standing on the record however this review concludes. A beat and then almost too quiet for the translator to fully render something that might have been the Vashter equivalent of a held breath. The Covenant has not received an answer to a roll call in longer than I have been alive. Come safely, come quickly, and Ambassador, welcome back. It was the first kindness anyone had offered her since the transmission began, and Naomi Reyes, 41 light-years from home and holding the entire future of her species in a 4-minute broadcast, allowed herself exactly 3 seconds to feel the relief of it before the cold, clear part of her mind reminded her that a welcome and a review were 2 very different things, and that somewhere in that chamber, a voice with the clipped contemptuous accent of the Ashen Directorate, had not said a single word of welcome at all. The 7 days it took the Wanderlight to reach the Threnody Spire, under the escort of 2 sleek Vastar cruisers that had arrived at the relay station less than a day after Naomi's transmission, were the longest of her life. The escort ships were not unfriendly, exactly. Their commander, a Vastar officer named Sarek Voth, kept the Wanderlight informed of every course correction with scrupulous, almost excessive courtesy, and twice invited Ambassador Reyes to a formal meal aboard his own vessel. An invitation she accepted both times, understanding it for what it was, an opportunity for the Vastar to study humanity up close, and an opportunity for her to do the same to them. Sarek Voth was younger than she'd expected. For a commander trusted with an escort this politically sensitive, Vastar biology ran long, and by human reckoning he might have been anywhere from 60 to 200 years old, but something in the way he carried himself, quick and curious, and not yet worn smooth by decades of caution, told her he was young for his people. He asked more questions over that first meal than she answered, about Earth's rebuilding, about the new subspace route, about what it had felt like to grow up in a civilization that measured its history by a wound instead of a triumph. The long silence is taught to Vastar cadets as a case study, he told her, on the second night, over a meal of something dense and faintly metallic tasting that her translator insisted was the nearest equivalent to Bria. In failure analysis, how an entire alliance can fail one of its members without any single decision being wrong. Every rescue mission we sent was reasonable. Every resource we redirected elsewhere when the corridor would not reopen was defensible. And the sum of 100 reasonable decisions was that we let a species we had sworn to protect vanish for 2 centuries. He set down his utensil, an oddly delicate gesture from someone built for war. I did not expect, when I was assigned to command your escort, that the case study would answer back. Do you think the Covenant will let us stay? Naomi asked, because she had learned over a career of diplomacy that directness earned more honesty than caution ever did. Sarek was quiet for a moment. I think, he said finally, that the Ashen Directorate does not want you to, and I think you will need to understand why before you understand anything else that happens at the Spire. He would not say more than that night, but 2 days later, as the Wanderlight's crude and battered hull came into visual range of the Threnody Spire for the first time, a structure so vast it took Naomi a full 10 seconds to understand she was looking at a single station and not a small moon, Sarek sent her a data packet, unofficial and unlogged, containing everything the Vastar Concordance's public archives held on the Ashen Directorate's activities in Saul's old territory during the years of the Long Silence. It made for grim reading. In the decades after Earth's corridor collapsed and rescue efforts wound down, the region of space the Saul Compact had once controlled, not just the home system, but the transit lanes, resource claims, and border territories humanity had spent 31 years establishing as a Covenant member, had been declared, by Covenant law, unclaimed, available for redistribution to any member species willing to develop it. The Ashen Directorate, a rising coalition that had barely existed at the time of Earth's induction, had petitioned for and received the overwhelming majority of that redistribution, on the grounds that Saul's territory bordered their own expanding sphere, and that Earth's continued absence made human claims moot. Over 180 years, the Ashen Directorate had built an entire economic empire on the bones of what had once been humanity's frontier: trade routes, mining claims, and buried in a technical appendix Naomi had to read 3 times before she understood its implications. Exclusive development rights to a region of deep space, just past Saul's old borders that Covenant surveys, back in the earliest days of humanity's membership, had flagged as containing something the original reports simply called an anomaly of significant but unquantified value. Naomi did not know what the anomaly was, but she understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent a career learning to see the shape of a lie before its edges were fully drawn. Exactly what it meant that a species with no history of wanting Earth gone had been the primary beneficiary of Earth's disappearance. And exactly what it meant that this same species delegate had been the first and only voice in that chamber to demand proof that humanity was telling the truth. She did not sleep the last night before the Wanderlight docked at the Threnody Spire. She spent it instead drafting and redrafting the opening statement she would give to the Covenant's Standing Committee on Membership and Return, aware that whatever she said in that room would be the first impression an entire galaxy formed of a species it had spent 2 centuries slowly, quietly forgetting. The Threnody Spire's interior defied easy description, and Naomi, stepping off the Wanderlight into a reception hall built for beings of 41 different shapes and sizes, found herself grateful that no camera existed to capture the way her breath caught. The hall soared upward in tiers of pale, faintly luminous stone that seemed to have grown rather than been built, each tier home to a different atmosphere, a different gravity, a different slice of the galaxy's staggering diversity, all somehow coexisting within sightlines of each other through vast transparent membranes that Naomi's translator informed her were a Korathi biotechnology nearly as old as the Covenant itself. She was met at the base of the reception hall by the Ilan elder whose voice she had recognized in the chamber, a being who introduced herself as Vel Ashmarine, and whose physical form, tall and faceted and the deep, still blue-black of a night sky without stars, moved with a slowness that Naomi realized after a moment was not frailty, but deliberateness, the unhurried economy of motion of someone who had long ago stopped needing to rush toward anything. "I remember your species," Vel Ashmarine said, without preamble, as the two of them walked together through a corridor that curved gently upward toward the chamber where the Standing Committee waited. "I was young when the first envoy was sent to your world. I argued, in my own assembly, that a species so recently finished tearing itself apart could not possibly be trusted with the responsibilities of Covenant membership. I was wrong, and I have had 187 years to regret being wrong in the specific way I was, because I was one of the voices, decades later, who argued that continued search efforts for Saul were an unaffordable sentiment rather than an obligation." Naomi did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and Vel Ashmarine seemed to take the silence as its own kind of answer. "I tell you this not for absolution," the Ilan elder continued. "I tell you because you are about to walk into a room full of beings who will each, in their own way, need to reconcile what they did or did not do during your absence, and it will be easier for you, and wiser, if you understand that the guilt in that room is not uniform. Some delegates mourn you and feel shame. Some do not remember you at all. 40 of the Covenant's current member species joined after your disappearance and know Earth only as a name in an old registry. And some," she said, and here, for the first time, something sharpened in her ancient voice, "profited from your absence in ways they would very much prefer this committee did not examine too closely." "The Ashen Directorate," Naomi said. Vel Ashmarine's faceted head inclined, a fraction in something like acknowledgement. "I did not say that," she said, "but I did not need to, did I?" The Standing Committee on Membership and Return convened in a chamber smaller and starker than the grand amphitheater of the sundering ceremony, a circular room with seating for perhaps 30 delegates, walls of the same pale living stone, and at its center, a raised dais where Naomi Reyes stood alone, having declined the offer of a seated position. Because some instinct honed over a career of difficult negotiations told her that this was a room where she needed every advantage of presence she could claim. Magistrate Aelthesarine presided again, flanked by delegates representing a cross-section of the Covenant's membership, the patient, ancient weight of the Ilan, the quick, precise plurality of the Korathi assembly, 3 delegates who spoke in overlapping cadences that Naomi's translator struggled to render as a single voice, a scattering of species she had never encountered and whose names she was still learning to pronounce. And seated with careful, deliberate stillness near the chamber's far edge, the Ashen Directorate's delegate, a tall, sharp-featured being with skin the color of old iron and eyes that tracked Naomi's every movement with the patient attention of a predator that had already decided how the hunt would end. Ambassador Reyes, Magistrate Althesarine began, this committee has 3 questions before it today, and I will state them plainly so that there is no confusion about the scope of these proceedings. First, is the Sol Compact you represent genuinely continuous with the Sol Compact that joined this covenant 230 years ago, or has enough changed that we are, in truth, considering the membership petition of a new civilization rather than the return of an old one? Second, does the Sol Compact retain the capacity and the will to meet the obligations of covenant membership, given the resources your species now controls? And third, and I will not pretend this question is comfortable to ask, is there any truth to the concern, raised in preliminary filings by several delegations, that your species' return is motivated less by a desire to rejoin this covenant than by a desire to reclaim assets and territories that have, in your absence, been lawfully redistributed to other members? Naomi had known the third question was coming. Sarek Voth's warning and the data packet he had shared had prepared her for it. But hearing it spoken aloud, in that measured, formal voice, in front of a room that would decide her species' fate based partly on how she answered, still landed like a blow. "I'll answer them in order if the committee will permit," she said, and was grateful her voice came out steady. "On the question of continuity, I was born on Earth, 40 years after the long silence began. I have never set foot in Covenant space before this week. Everything I know of this Covenant, I learned from archives my grandparents' generation preserved specifically so that someone like me could stand in a room like this one and speak with authority about who we are. The Sol Compact that exists today governs the same worlds, under the same founding charter, ratified by the same lineage of institutions, as the compact that joined this covenant 2 centuries ago. We have changed. No civilization survives 200 years of isolation unchanged. But I would ask this committee to consider that the covenant itself has changed just as much in that time, and none of you have suggested that makes the Vashtor Concordance, or the Ilan Assembly, or the Korathi Collective any less continuous with the civilizations that founded this alliance 4 centuries ago. Change is not the opposite of continuity. It is, very often, the proof of it." A ripple moved through the chamber, not quite approval, but attention, sharpened. Naomi pressed forward before the moment could cool. "On the question of capacity, I will not pretend the Sol Compact returns to this covenant as an equal to its most powerful members. We do not have the Vashtor Concordance's fleets, or the Korathi Collective's construction capabilities, or 4 centuries of continuous covenant technological development behind us. What we have is a species that spent 150 years rebuilding everything it lost, alone, with no help and no guarantee that any help was coming, and that used those years to develop a subspace navigation method your own Covenant survey ships have never successfully attempted. I would submit that a civilization capable of that is not a burden to this alliance. It is, potentially, one of the more valuable additions this covenant has made in a generation. And I say that not to bargain for our seat, but because I believe it is true, and because I think this committee deserves an honest accounting of what we bring rather than a plea for charity." She saw, out of the corner of her eye, the faint shift of interest among several of the unfamiliar delegates, and felt something in her chest loosen fractionally. But the third question still waited, and she made herself meet the Ashen Directorate delegate's iron-colored eyes directly as she answered it. "And on the third question," she said, "I will be as honest as I know how to be, because I think this committee will see through anything less. We did not know, until 7 days ago, what had become of our old territories during the long silence. We did not know they had been redistributed. We did not come here to reclaim them, because until an hour before I stepped off my ship, I did not know there was anything to reclaim. I came here because you were about to speak my species' name for the last time, and I could not let that happen while there was still breath in us to answer. If this committee finds in the course of its review that the redistribution of Saul's former territories was conducted lawfully and in good faith, the Saul Compact will not contest it. We are not here to relitigate the past. We are here to ask for a seat at the table, going forward, on whatever terms this covenant finds just. She paused, and let just enough of what she actually felt bleed into her next words to make them land as truth rather than strategy, because she had learned, over years of difficult rooms, that the line between the two was often only honesty. But I will say this plainly, because I think it needs to be said in this chamber at least once. It troubles me that the delegation most eager to prove my species is lying is also, as I understand it, the delegation that benefited most from our absence. I raise that not as an accusation. I raise it because I believe this committee is capable of asking the same question I am asking, and I would rather ask it aloud, honestly, than have it whispered in corridors after I've left the room. The chamber went very still. The Ashen Directorate delegate's expression did not change, but something in the set of his shoulders sharpened, and when he spoke, his voice carried the same clipped, cold precision Naomi had heard through the relay a week ago. I am Directorenv Kes Vardin, representing the Ashen Directorate before this committee, he said, and I would remind the ambassador that implication is not evidence, and that this committee's business is verification, not innuendo. My delegation's position is simple. The Covenant's laws regarding unclaimed territory are clear and were followed to the letter in every redistribution my government received. If the ambassador wishes to allege otherwise, I invite her to bring evidence rather than suggestion. Absent that, I would ask this committee to focus on the actual questions before it, beginning with verification of this delegation's claims, which, I note, rest entirely on the word of 4 exhausted travelers, and a data trail this committee has not yet had the opportunity to independently confirm. It was, Naomi had to admit even as her pulse quickened with the danger of it, a clean and effective deflection, technically unanswerable without the evidence she did not yet have, and delivered with just enough procedural correctness to make her earlier accusation sound, in retrospect, like exactly the kind of unfounded suggestion he'd called it. Magistrate Aelthesarine's antennae dipped, a gesture Naomi had learned over the past week to associate with the vaster equivalent of a considering frown. Directoren, Vardin raises a fair proc. Edgeral point, she said. Ambassador Reyes, this committee cannot rule on the basis of unsupported allegation, however well-founded your suspicion may feel to you. What we can do, and what I propose we do, is grant a formal verification period, 14 standard days, during which the Saul Compact's claims will be independently examined by a neutral technical delegation, and during which any party with relevant evidence on any question before this committee may submit it for the record. Her gaze moved, deliberate and even, from Naomi to Kes Vardin and back. I would remind all parties that this committee takes seriously not only the question of whether Earth has returned, but the question of how it came to be so thoroughly presumed dead in the first place. If there is a story here larger than one ambassador's 4-minute transmission, this committee intends to hear it before any final vote is called. It was not a victory. It was, Naomi understood, only a delay, but a delay that kept Earth's name on the registry, kept the review open, and gave her 14 days to find whatever evidence existed of what Vel Ashmarine had so carefully not quite said in the corridor outside. 14 days to prove, not just that humanity deserved a seat at this table, but that something more than bad luck had emptied the one it used to hold. She left the chamber with Sarek Voth waiting near the entrance. His expression, carefully neutral in the way she was learning, meant he had opinions he wasn't yet willing to voice in a public corridor. That went about as well as it could have, he said quietly, once they put some distance between themselves and the chamber doors. Vardin wanted a summary dismissal today. You didn't give him one. 14 days isn't much, Naomi said. No, Sarek agreed. But it's enough time to ask the right questions if you know where to look. And I think, he said, glancing back toward the chamber, that Elder Ashmarine already knows exactly where that is. She spent 187 years wondering if she should have looked harder while it still mattered. I don't think she's going to waste this chance to finally do it. The 14 days that followed were, in Naomi's later recollection, less a diplomatic proceeding than a slow, careful excavation of records, of old survey data, of the quiet, guarded memories of beings who had lived through the long silence and never quite let themselves examine what they'd seen. Vel Ashmarine proved, as Sarek had predicted, to be the key that unlocked most of it. As an Ilan elder with decades of standing on the Covenant's Historical Preservation Council, she had access to archives that even the Standing Committee's neutral technical delegation had to formally request. And more than access, she had memory, the long, unbroken memory of a species that did not forget the way shorter-lived civilizations sometimes conveniently did. It was Vel who found, buried in a 180-year-old survey log that no one had cross-referenced with the Sol territory redistribution filings in over a century, the detail that changed everything. The anomaly of significant but unquantified value flagged just past Sol's old borders, the one Naomi had glimpsed in Sarek's unofficial data packet, had first been surveyed not after Earth's disappearance, but 11 months before the long silence began, by a joint Covenant technical mission that had included, among its personnel, 2 junior surveyors from what was then a minor, unremarkable coalition called the Ashen Trade Compact. The anomaly, the survey log recorded in dry, technical language that took Naomi and a Korathi archivist named Threswen 3 full days to properly decode, was not natural. It was a structure, vast, ancient, embedded in the fabric of local subspace itself, of a design and origin the original survey team could not identify but flagged, in language that made Naomi's blood run cold when she finally understood it, as potentially capable of localized subspace corridor manipulation, pending further study. Further study, the log noted with bureaucratic finality, had been deferred, due to the region's low priority and the impending transfer of survey resources to more pressing Covenant business. 11 months later, the Sol corridor collapsed. I don't want to believe what I think this means, Naomi said, on the 9th night of the verification period, sitting across a small table from Vel Ashmarine and Threswen in a quiet reading chamber deep in the spire's archive levels. The survey logs decoded text glowing softly on the table's surface between them. You're telling me there was a structure, right on the edge of our territory, capable of collapsing a subspace corridor, that someone knew about, 11 months before ours did exactly that, and it was just deferred, filed away. I am telling you what the record says, Vel Ashmarine replied, careful as always to distinguish between fact and inference. I am not yet telling you what it means. There are explanations that do not require malice. Deferred studies were common in that era. The Covenant surveyed thousands of anomalies a year and could investigate only a fraction. It is possible this was simple, tragic bureaucratic oversight, and the corridor's collapse 11 months later was genuine coincidence. Do you believe that? Naomi asked. The Ilan elder was quiet for a long moment, her faceted features catching the reading chamber's soft light in shifting patterns that Naomi had learned, over the past 9 days, corresponded roughly to deep and uncomfortable thought. I have spent 187 years believing that, because the alternative was unbearable, she said finally. I do not believe it anymore. Not since we found the second name in the survey log's personnel record, the technical lead who signed off on deferring further study of the anomaly, and who recommended, in the very same filing, that Sol territory be flagged for expedited redistribution priority in the event of member incapacity. That recommendation was filed 11 months before the corridor collapsed. Ambassador, before anyone had any reason to believe your species' territory would become available at all. Naomi felt something go very cold and very still inside her. Who signed it? Threswen, the Korathi archivist, answered in her people's characteristic overlapping cadence, three voices arriving at the same words a fraction of a second apart, a habit Naomi had come to find oddly reassuring in its precision. The filing bears the technical designation and personal seal of a junior Ashen Trade Compact surveyor named Kes Varding. The name landed in the quiet reading chamber like a struck bell. He would have been young, Vel Ashmarine said quietly, barely more than an apprentice by the standards of his own people. It is possible, I want to stress this, Ambassador, because it matters, that he was not the architect of whatever happened to your corridor. It is possible he was simply a junior officer whose deferred recommendation was later exploited by others in his government, without his knowledge, once the corridor collapsed and the opportunity it created became clear. I do not yet know which is true, but I know that the being who stood in that committee chamber 9 days ago and demanded evidence before he would entertain the faintest suggestion of wrongdoing is the same being whose name sits at the bottom of the filing that made his people's fortune. Naomi sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shape of the 14 days ahead of her shift and sharpen. This was no longer only a question of proving humanity's continuity or its capacity to meet covenant obligations. It was potentially a question of exposing the truth behind the single greatest catastrophe in her species' history. A truth that a powerful, entrenched covenant member had spent nearly 2 centuries building an empire on top of, and would not surrender without a fight far uglier than anything a committee chamber's procedural courtesies could contain. If I bring this to the committee, she said slowly, and I'm wrong if it really was just bureaucratic oversight, just coincidence, I don't just lose the argument. I make an enemy of one of the most powerful delegations in this covenant, on the same week we're asking to be let back in. That could cost us everything, even if we're right about the corridor and wrong about the intent. Yes, Vel Ashmarine agreed, without softening the truth of it. That is the risk. I cannot tell you whether to take it, Ambassador. I can only tell you that I spent 187 years choosing not to look too closely at an uncomfortable question, and I have never once in all that time felt that choice made me wiser, only quieter. Naomi thought, in the silence that followed, of every human who had died in the brutal first 30 years after the long silence. Colonists on Mars who had frozen to death in life support failures no one on Earth had the resources to fix fast enough. The food riots of the second decade. The entire generation that had grown up believing the stars had simply decided humanity wasn't worth saving. She thought of her own grandmother, who had been 11 years old when the corridor collapsed, and who had spent the rest of her long life quietly, doggedly cataloging every scrap of covenant knowledge Earth still possessed, telling anyone who would listen that someday, someone would need to know it all, and that Earth owed it to itself not to let the not knowing become permanent. If there was any chance that all of that grief, all of that hard, unnecessary suffering, had been the deliberate cost of someone else's ambition, she found she could not make herself choose the quieter path, however much safer it might have been. I want to bring it to the committee, she said, but I want to do right, not as an accusation, as a question the covenant deserves to have answered, whatever the answer turns out to be. Can you help me build the case properly, not to win, to be true? Vel Ashmarine's faceted head inclined, slow and deliberate, in something that might, in an Ilan elder who had lived through 4 centuries of careful diplomacy, have been the closest thing to pride that her long, patient species allowed itself to show. Yes, Ambassador, she said, I believe I can. Before I tell you what happened when Naomi Reyes walked back into that committee chamber with a 180-year-old survey log and an accusation that could end her career, her species' return, or Kes Vardin's entire government? I want to ask you something, because I think it's the kind of question that's worth sitting with. If you were in Naomi's position, holding evidence that might expose the truth behind your world's greatest tragedy, knowing that being wrong could cost your species its one chance at rejoining the stars, would you have brought it forward, or would you have played it safe and asked for the seat without the fight? Let me know what you'd have done down in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how people land on this one. And if this story's got its hooks in you so far, do me a favor and hit like and subscribe before we go on. It actually helps a lot more than you'd think, and it means more of these get made. Okay, back to the spire. The remaining 5 days of the verification period passed in a blur of careful preparation. Naomi, Vel Ashmarine, and Threswen worked nearly around the clock, cross-referencing the survey log against every other piece of documentation the Covenant's archives held from that era: trade filings, personnel records, the minutes of committees so obscure most Covenant citizens had never heard of them. What emerged was not a single smoking gun, but something Naomi found in some ways more damning: a slow, patient pattern, stretched across 2 centuries, of an ambitious surveyor who had risen decade by decade, alongside the fortunes of a coalition that had transformed itself from a minor trade compact into one of the Covenant's most powerful blocs, built almost entirely on the foundation of territory that had become available the exact moment Saul went silent. It did not prove, conclusively, that Kes Vardin had caused the long silence. The technology capable of the kind of localized subspace manipulation the original survey log had flagged was, as far as the Covenant's archives could determine, beyond anything the young surveyor could plausibly have accessed alone. But it proved, beyond any reasonable dispute, that he had known, had documented in his own hand, 11 months before the fact, that something dangerous sat at the edge of Saul's territory, capable of exactly the kind of catastrophe that followed, and had recommended in the same breath that Saul's territory be prepared for redistribution in the event that catastrophe occurred. It was not proof of murder. It was proof of foreknowledge, and of a species' fortune built, at minimum, on a devastating silence about what that foreknowledge might have prevented. When the Standing Committee reconvened on the 14th day, the chamber was fuller than it had been at the first hearing. Word had spread, in the strange, fast way it always did in institutions built to manage information, that something significant was coming, and delegates who had sent proxies to the first session attended in person for the second. Naomi stood on the dais once more, Vel Ashmarine and Threswen seated in the gallery behind her, and felt the particular, familiar calm that had always settled over her throughout her career, in the moment just before the hardest part of any negotiation began. 14 days ago, she began, this committee asked me 3 questions. I answered 2 of them as fully as I was able. The third, whether my species' return is motivated by a desire to reclaim territory unlawfully, I answered honestly, and I stand by that answer. We did not come here seeking to reclaim anything. But in the course of the verification this committee ordered, my delegation uncovered something I believe this committee is obligated to hear, whatever the consequences, because it bears directly on the question this committee itself raised: how Saul came to be presumed dead in the first place. She laid it out plainly, without embellishment, letting the document speak in the dry, damning language of bureaucratic record rather than accusation. The survey log, the flagged anomaly, the deferred study, the redistribution recommendation filed 11 months before there was any territory to redistribute, and the name at the bottom of every page. The chamber's reaction was immediate and fractured: gasps and hard, rustling silences in a dozen registers, delegates turning toward Kes Vardin with expressions Naomi could not fully read but understood the shape of instinctively, the universal language of a room recalculating everything it thought it knew. Kes Vardin rose from his seat before Magistrate Aelthesarine could formally invite a response, and for the first time since Naomi had encountered him, something other than cold composure showed in his iron-colored eyes, something sharp and cornered, and underneath it, unmistakably afraid. "This is exactly the kind of baseless innuendo I warned this committee about 14 days ago," he said, his voice pitched higher and faster than before. "A junior officer's deferred survey recommendation from 2 centuries ago is being twisted into an accusation of sabotage against an entire government. I ask this committee, I demand this committee recognize this for what it is: a desperate attempt by a species facing exclusion to manufacture a scandal large enough to distract from its own unproven claims. No one has accused your government of sabotage, Director Envoy," Naomi said, before the magistrate could respond, and kept her voice level and even, refusing to match his rising heat with her own. "I have presented this committee with a document your own government's records office confirms is authentic, showing that you personally documented a dangerous anomaly at the edge of Saul's territory 11 months before that territory's owner vanished, and that you personally recommended, in the same filing, that the territory be prepared for redistribution in exactly the circumstances that followed. I am not asking this committee to conclude that you caused the long silence. I don't know that, and I won't claim to know it. I am asking this committee to ask you directly why you never disclosed what you knew, not in the 6 years the Covenant spent searching for survivors, not in the 180 years since, not even now, sitting in this room, until a dead world's ambassador found your own signature buried in an archive you must have assumed no one would ever read again." The chamber's attention swung fully onto Kes Vardin, and Naomi watched something shift in his posture, the careful composure of a skilled diplomat cracking under the specific, unbearable pressure of being asked a question to which every possible answer was damning. "I was a junior surveyor," he said, and his voice had lost its earlier sharpness, gone instead thin and defensive in a way that told Naomi, more clearly than any document could have, that they had found the truth. "I flagged an anomaly for further study, as regulations required. That study was deferred by my superiors, not by me. I had no authority to pursue it further, and no reason at the time to believe it posed any specific threat to Saul or any other system." The redistribution recommendation was standard contingency language, included in dozens of survey filings from that era. Standard contingency language for what exactly? Vel Ashmarine's voice cut in from the gallery, quiet, ancient, and utterly without mercy. "I have reviewed 4 centuries of Covenant survey filings in my capacity on the Historical Preservation Council, Director Enva. I have never once, in that entire span, encountered another example of a junior surveyor including unsolicited redistribution contingencies for a fully populated, currently active member system's territory, in a routine anomaly filing. If this is standard language, I invite you to produce even one other instance of it. I do not believe you can, because I do not believe it exists." The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it in that chamber. Total, absolute, the particular quiet of a room in which everyone present understood that something irreversible had just happened. Magistrate Aelthesarine let it stretch for a long moment before she spoke, and when she did, her voice carried a weight Naomi had not heard from her before. "Director Vardin, this committee will require a full accounting from your government, under formal Covenant investigative authority, of the origin and disposition of the anomaly referenced in this filing, and of every decision made regarding Saul territory redistribution in the years following the long silence. This is no longer a question this committee can resolve informally." She turned, and for the first time addressed Naomi directly, something almost gentle entering her formal cadence. "Ambassador Reyes, I want to be clear with you and with this chamber. This committee cannot yet say with certainty what happened to your corridor, or who bears responsibility for it. That determination will take time, and it may take longer than any of us would wish. But I can say, without further need for deliberation, that the question this committee was originally convened to answer, whether the Sol Compact is who it claims to be, and whether it deserves this covenant's trust, has, in the course of these proceedings, answered itself. A species that spent 150 years alone, rebuilding everything it lost, and then spent its first days back among the stars pursuing an uncomfortable truth at genuine risk to its own return, rather than simply accepting a quiet, convenient seat. That is not a species this covenant should be debating whether to readmit. That is a species this covenant should be grateful has come back at all. The chamber, after a beat of stunned quiet, began to fill with sound, not the rustling murmur of earlier sessions, but something warmer, something that in a human room might have been called applause, rendered across 41 species into a symphony of approval Naomi had no framework to fully process, standing alone on the dais with her heart hammering and her eyes, unexpectedly, stinging. "This committee moves," Elthesarine continued, raising her voice slightly to carry over the chamber's response, "to recommend to the full Covenant Assembly the immediate and unconditional reinstatement of the Sol Compact's membership, with full historical continuity recognized from the date of original induction 230 years ago. I ask for a formal vote." The vote, when it came, was not unanimous. The Ashen Directorate's remaining allies abstained, a small, cold pocket of silence in an otherwise overwhelming show of support. But it did not need to be unanimous. It needed only to pass, and it passed by a margin so large that Magistrate Elthesarine, reading the final tally, allowed something that might, in a Vashtor accustomed to 4 centuries of careful neutrality, have been the ghost of a smile. "Ambassador Reyes," she said, "on behalf of the Covenant of Bound Stars, it is my honor to inform you that your world's name will not be struck from the registry today, or any day hereafter. The roll call your species answered a week ago stands, permanently, on the record. The first answer this covenant has received to a sundering roll call in 4 centuries. I would be grateful, if you are willing, to have you stand before the full assembly when the sundering ceremony resumes, so that every delegation that heard your name read as lost may hear, in person, what it sounds like when the lost come home." Naomi Reyes, who had spent 7 days crossing dead space on a gamble that could have ended everything, and 14 more days building a case that could have made a powerful enemy of the wrong ally, found that she did not, in that moment, have a diplomat's careful words ready. She had only the truth, offered as plainly as she knew how. "I would be honored," she said, "and I want this committee to know my species didn't survive 150 years alone because we were exceptional or destined or chosen for anything. We survived because we refused to accept that the door was closed for good, even when every reasonable measure of the universe told us it probably was. I think that's true of a lot of civilizations in this room, if you go back far enough in your own histories. I don't think we're special. I think we're just stubborn and scared, and we didn't want to be alone. I suspect that's not so different from anyone else." The sundering ceremony resumed 3 days later, in the same grand amphitheater where Earth's name had first been called toward its ending. And this time, when Magistrate Elthesarine reached the point in the ancient ritual where the presumed dead were formally released, she paused, set aside the closing gesture she had begun a week earlier and never finished, and instead read a new line, one that Naomi understood from the reverent hush that met it, had never been spoken in that chamber before. "Sol System," Elthesarine said, and her voice for the first time in the entire proceeding carried something unmistakably like joy. "Third planet, designation, Earth, species, human, status, answered." The chamber rose, all 41 species at once, in a gesture Naomi would later learn was reserved, in Covenant tradition. Only for moments the whole assembly agreed deserved to be remembered by everyone present, together, at the same instant, and Naomi Reyes stood in the center of it, 300 delegates from across the galaxy on their feet for a small, stubborn, scarred civilization that had refused, for 150 years in the dark, to let its own story end without a fight. She thought, standing there, of her grandmother cataloging old Covenant knowledge in a quiet room on a planet that the rest of the galaxy had already started to forget, insisting that someday, someone would need to know it all. She thought of every human who had not lived to see this moment, who had died cold or hungry or afraid in the brutal early decades of the long silence, believing, some of them, that the universe had simply decided humanity wasn't worth saving. She wished, with an ache that had no room in it for the formal words this occasion required, that they could all have been standing here with her, see that the universe had never made that decision at all, that it had only been waiting, the way it turned out it had been waiting the whole time, for humanity to answer when its name was called. The investigation into Kes Vardin and the Ashen Directorate's role in the long silence would take years to fully resolve. Naomi would remain involved in it, on and off, for most of the following decade, as the Covenant's formal inquiry slowly, methodically established that the anomaly at Saul's border had indeed been artificially and deliberately triggered, though by whom, precisely, and on whose orders would remain contested and partially unresolved even after Vardin's own government, faced with overwhelming evidence of what its rise to power had cost, quietly stripped him of rank, and opened its own internal reckoning with a past it had spent 2 centuries not looking at too closely. Some of Saul's old territories were eventually returned, through years of careful, unhurried negotiation that Naomi insisted, against the urging of more hawkish voices back on Earth, be conducted with patience and good faith rather than the leverage of a wronged party's grievance. Because she had learned in the Threnody Spire that the covenant she wanted her species to belong to was not one built on old scores settled, but on trust slowly, deliberately rebuilt, the same way Earth itself had been rebuilt. Not in a single triumphant moment, but in 150 years of small, stubborn, unglamorous work. What mattered in the end, what Naomi Reyes would say, decades later, when asked by a new generation of human diplomats what she remembered most from that first extraordinary week back among the stars, was not the vindication, or the investigation, or even the eventual, hard-won return of old Covenant territory. It was the sound of 41 species rising to their feet at once, in a language none of them fully shared, to mark the moment a world the galaxy had already grieved, already released, already begun to forget, answered its own name instead of letting it go quietly into the registry of the lost. Humanity had not been rescued. It had not been remembered out of some ancient debt owed, or restored by anyone's mercy. It had crossed 150 years of silence and 3 years of impossible space on its own 2 feet, arrived at the very last second of its own funeral, and simply, stubbornly, refused to be counted among the dead. And somewhere in the vast, patient turning of the covenant of bound stars, in libraries that would hold the record for centuries after every being in that chamber had themselves passed into memory, a new line was added to the ancient registry, beside a name once marked lost and now, permanently, marked found. A small, young, remarkable species, 300 light-years from the nearest star most of its neighbors called home, who had learned, in the hardest way a civilization can learn anything, that being left behind and being finished were never in fact the same thing at all, and who had earned, not through conquest or fortune or the favor of older powers, but through patience, honesty, and the simple refusal to disappear quietly, a permanent place among the stars they had once feared they would never see again. The Wanderlight would eventually return home, 3 years later, carrying with it the first new subspace route between Saul and the wider Covenant in nearly 2 centuries, and a diplomatic delegation, the size of which Earth had not sent anywhere since before the long silence began. Naomi Reyes stood on its bridge as the ship crossed back into Saul's system for the first time in over 3 years of her own life, and watched, through the viewport, as Earth turned slowly beneath them, blue and green and utterly unremarkable among the galaxy's vast catalog of worlds. And yet, to every human aboard that ship, and to a growing number of beings across 41 other species who had watched one small, stubborn civilization answer its own roll call, entirely, unmistakably, home. It had taken 187 years, 3 generations of quiet, unglamorous rebuilding, and one 4-minute transmission sent with no guarantee it would ever be heard. But the galaxy had called Earth's name one last time, expecting only silence in return. And Earth had answered,